Okay, folks, if you don't mind, we have a lot to cover today, and I'd like to get started as soon as we can. Okay, so I'm going to try to get through as many slides as I can today. I probably won't be able to get through all of the cerebellar nuclei. Sorry, I can't speak over top of all of you, so you're going to have to quiet down just a little bit, and I appreciate that greatly. Thank you. I'm going to try to get through as much of this as I can today, but I may not be able to get all the way through the cerebellar nuclei, which is fine motor control, but we'll try to get through as much as we can. I sort of left off talking about the somatosensory cortex and how we map different areas to this area of the cortex that you see here, and this is the postcentral gyrus, and on this postcentral gyrus we have the entire map of the sensory receptors encoded here on this little slab of this particular gyrus that we're also calling either somatosensory area S1 or another name for it being area 3B. And this is sort of where we left off. And we had sort of talked very briefly about the fact that every square inch or every square millimeter of your body actually has receptors that are found on it. And when we're talking about area 3B, we're talking about the somatosensory receptors that are detecting pressure changes on your skin, that are detecting all sorts of sensory information coming from the surface of your skin, and a little bit from the proprioceptors that are involved in your joints. If we were to take a look at one of those areas back here on the cortex related to your fingers, and we were able to isolate the part of the cortex that was responsive when you started stimulating your finger, and we were able to map it back to this area in the cortex. And again, these were gross experiments that were done by Walter Penfeld at McGill University in the 1950s, where he was actually stimulating different areas of the brain and working backwards from this. But if we were able to do this, we would actually see that the cortex, the region of the cortex that is responding to when you touch that finger, and only when you touch that finger, will actually have this sort of organization to it. So the first thing is we already learned earlier in the course that we have 6 different layers in the cortex. We're talking about the cortex. In addition to that, in this little slab of the cortex, we would only see the representation of areas that are on the receptive fields that are touching your finger. So for example, this area would be represented on this area of the cortex, so would this sort of hashed line, and this sort of overlap area. This is on a different slab of cortex. It may be nearby in terms of spatially, like on your hand versus your finger, but if we're only looking at this part of the cortex, when we touch this, we wouldn't see any activation because that's on the next hypercolumn. And what we do is we call this the hypercolumn, and this organization is a very consistent one throughout the entire brain. So each area in the brain is mapped out into this hypercolumn organization that you see here. We only have certain receptive fields, not all of the receptive fields that are mapped on it. We also know that we are going to get different types of receptive input being separated out. That was one of the bullet points that was on the last slide that I showed to you, that from the thalamus, and all input is coming from the thalamus, that we have the separation of slowly adapting and rapidly adapting sensory inputs. We know that on your skin, some of the sensory inputs are rapidly adapting, like you won't be able to feel that something is on your skin anymore, and some are slowly adapting. Those sensory inputs are also being separated out in this little slab of the cortex. So this slab of the cortex that we're calling the hypercolumn has this organization where we have the separation of slow and rapidly adapting inputs, and this will represent the same point or the same area on the skin where we have these receptive fields. And again, on another nearby slab of the cortex, on another hypercolumn, we'll begin this same process again of the somatotopic organization of the next part of the hand. And again, we know that this is true functionally as well. It doesn't have to just be anatomical. This is an MRI, and it's a functional fMRI. If you were to do the same thing and you were to touch different areas on this person's hand, you would actually see this somatotopic organization. There is an order. There is an orderness to the way in which when you touch this part of the finger or this part of the finger, etc., that they're localized spatially in the same sort of order, and it is somatotopic. And if you're paying really close attention to this, you'll note that in PSL300, they like giving you the middle finger an awful lot on these slides. And this is sort of the fMRI of that area of the cortex, responding in the same way to different areas that are being touched on that middle finger. So again, the big thing is, in that cortex, in area 3B, where you are mapping out different somatotopic inputs, there's a way to separate out the information. It is organized spatially, which is what somatotopic means. And then from there, just like in the eye, that area, the area that we were just looking at, area S1 or area 3B, however you want to call it, that post-central gyrus, it will then send other axons out through different layers, and I have to apologize, I'm going the wrong way. So they're receiving input primarily at level 4, or level 4 in this slab of the cortex, but you will also see that you'll be sending out projections as well from some of the other layers, and we'll get into that in a few moments. So if you were to take a look at the organization of the brain, just like with the visual system where we started off in the occipital cortex, if this is the primary area where we're getting all of the mapping from the thalamus coming in, there will be projections to some of the other association areas. There are association areas very, very close by, association areas that are right behind area S1 or posterior to area S1. And even though you might be able to detect pressure on your skin, you wouldn't be able to tell if something was moving on your skin in area S1. That requires some of the association cortices that are right behind it to further process that information. So S1 is just telling you if different somatosensory receptors are being turned on, but they can't give you any more information until they send it to these association areas like association area 1 or association area 2 or association area 5. And so these other association areas will be able to put together that information about whether or not something that's touching your skin is like moving, or if it's moving in a certain direction or not. All of that has to be encoded in those separate areas, not in that first area S1. So for example, if we were to take a look at area 2 and area 5, if we were to take a look at one neuron in that particular area, we would see that that one neuron in area 2 and area 5 that's received all this somatosensory input, when your arm is in this position and it's resting up against the desk, you would see that it fires a lot and it responds to a particular arm movement or a particular arm configuration. And then if you were to take that same arm and you're still recording from that same area 2-5 neuron, so one neuron that we've been recording from and its recorded action potentials when your arm is in this position, that same arm and that same neuron, if you now raise your arm hasn't changed, you're still recording from the same neuron, it no longer responds. And that's because it processes the way in which your arm is located in space and the somatosensory receptors that are activated in a particular way. It is configured to fire only when it is in this particular configuration. So it tells you that there's a lot of higher order processing. Your arm hasn't changed, the neuron hasn't changed, but it responds to all these other inputs that are coming in to area 2 and 5. So there's lots of processing going on, in other words. And this is one of those common themes that we saw, and we've already seen this in vision. Association areas important for further processing. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the trigeminal thalamic tract. This is carried through cranial nerve 5. This really is a bypass and is carrying sensory information from your face and from your head into the same sorts of areas, and we'll bypass that for the time being. You don't have to worry about this slide. If you're really interested in it, you can come and talk to me and I'll be able to take you through some of the information on this slide if you're really interested. But this is the slide that I want you to pay more attention on. This slide and the slide that comes right after this. So we talked about these different receptors that are outside in the periphery. We need to be able to get them up into those areas of the brain. We talked about area S1. We talked about somatosensory processing. We talked about its somatotopic organization, that there is an order to how you see the representation of your hands and your fingers and your face, etc., based on the density of the different receptors. But how did we get that signal up there in the first place? We talked about things at this end. We talked about how different types of receptors like the Meissner's corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles, even thermoreceptors respond, but how do we actually get these signals up into the brain? Well, these make use of these different regions in the spinal cord. So again, this spinal thalamic tract, sometimes referred to as the anterior spinal thalamic tract, will contain information or convey information about pain sensation, temperature, light touch, pressure, tickle, and itch. And again, it uses three different neurons where we have sensory input coming in here through the dorsal ganglion. It then crosses over, it decussates really quickly, and then will go up this region laterally on the spinal cord all the way up into the thalamus, and then into, this is the level of the thalamus, and then into area S1 that we've just been talking about. And again, there's a lot to actually point out to you. So when we talk about these different tracks, and I'm going to show you these different tracks in a slightly different way, different locations on this spinal thalamic tract. So this entire thing is the spinal thalamic tract. It goes from your spine all the way up into the thalamus. It conveys all of this type of information that you see here. The lateral portions of this are more concentrated on pain as well as temperature. And the anterior part of this will transmit more information about light, touch, as well as pressure. Another way to look at this is that there is a anterior spinal thalamic tract here and the lateral spinal thalamic tract over here on the left and on the right respectively. There are some key fundamental differences. I told you that on that previous slide, you need to know what kind of information is coming in through the spinal thalamic tract. So pain information, temperature information, touch as well as tickle, itch information. But where they're actually synapsing, whether it's the anterior spinal thalamic tract on the left or the lateral spinal thalamic tract, are very, very different. So if you take a look at this, this is the spinal cord. You guys all remember the central gray area, right? So we can actually divide the central gray if it's at the very top portion that you see up here. We call this layer 1 or lamina 1. So the spinal thalamic tract, the lateral spinal thalamic tract, actually the first synapse makes a contact at the very upper or superficial layer in lamina 1. If you're talking about the anterior spinal thalamic tract though, it sends its projections all the way down to about lamina 4 or lamina 5. It's much deeper in the spinal cord, and you can see that it's not up here, it's all the way down here in a deeper layer. Where they then send their tracks, where this neuron here that it's making a synapse on will then send its axons is also different. So the axons now go up this region, the ventral region or the anterior portion of the spinal cord versus the lateral region. And again, all of this information is being conveyed. So when it gets up into the brain, this is going more medially. So we call this the medial pathway in the anterior spinal thalamic tract. And this is where C fibers and the lateral, the C fibers are primarily in this particular tract versus ones that contain A delta versus A beta fibers, which use the anterior spinal thalamic tract. And so they're different in terms of their location, they're different in terms of where the first synapses occur, and I want you to make sure that you're clear on that. Okay, so the anterior spinal thalamic and the lateral spinal thalamic tract, their first synapses are in very different layers in the spinal cord. And part of that will become important and relevant for you in a few slides. The other thing I want you to make note of, whether you're talking about the spinal thalamic tract that's in the anterior portion or the lateral portion, it doesn't matter. Both of them also contain what are known as wide dynamic range cells. That is a characteristic feature of the spinal thalamic tract and the spinal reticulothalamic tract. This neuron that sits right here in layer 4 or 5 or in lamina 1, these wide dynamic range neurons allow you to actually sense multiple things, not just pain, but also temperature, not just pain and temperature, but also itch. They're multimodal, okay? And that is a characteristic feature of the spinal thalamic and spinal reticulothalamic tracts, that we have these wide dynamic range neurons that respond to multiple inputs, mechanoreceptive and pain inputs. So again, we always have to be concerned about where all of these different things are going, and the spinal thalamic tract that's conveying information about touch, temperature, pain, etc., is making its primary connection. If this entire thing is the thalamus, the mini brain, and you can map out different sensations onto the mini brain, and we've already talked about the ventrocaudal nucleus that was mainly mechanoreceptive in the last lecture. In the spinal thalamic tract, we're primarily making synapses on the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, which you see down here. So again, spatially restricted, spatial information going into the thalamus is restricted, and then the thalamus then sends up spatially restricted information up into the area S1 in the cortex. So this gets into these wide dynamic range neurons. So these wide dynamic range neurons that you have all over your body, they will respond in your spinal cord. So here is a wide dynamic range neuron that is part of the spinal thalamic tract. And this wide dynamic range neuron will actually respond. If we're recording from this neuron here, it will respond when you, for example, have light touch on your hand through the A beta fibers, or if you pinch your hand and activate the A delta and C fibers, because they all make synapses on this wide dynamic range neuron, they will all activate this wide dynamic range neuron. This will respond to pinch as well as to light pressure. It will also respond to heat as well as to cold. It will respond, in other words, this wide dynamic range neuron receives multiple inputs from your skin. It gets touch information, pain information, thermoreceptive information from your skin. So this will become a problem in a few minutes when we go back and talk about it. But for the time being, I wanted to go back and revisit this idea of this wide dynamic range, multi-modes, multi types of sensation neuron that we have in the spinal thalamic tract. Any questions about this before we go on? So you need to know the difference between the anterior and lateral spinal thalamic tract, the information that's conveyed by the spinal thalamic tract, the fact that you have these wide dynamic range neurons that have multiple inputs, and hopefully when you see things like A beta, A delta, C fibers, some of that will make sense to you. And we'll come back and talk about this substantia gelatinosa, which is what SG stands for, in a few minutes. But any questions about this before we go on? Okay. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the spinocerebellar tract. It's just for your own information. We're going to be talking about the cerebellum and the cerebellar control of movement later on in the course, later on this evening if I have time. And this is where if you are actually trying to play the piano and you actually have to be able to monitor your hands, you need the spinal thalamic tract to make sure that what you're actually doing is the motor activity that you're actually engaging in. Are your fingers actually doing what they're supposed to be doing? We use this spinal thalamic tract or spinal cerebellar tract to give us this kind of information. And other than that, you don't need to memorize the anatomical details of this particular pathway. However, you do need to know some details about the spinal reticulothalamic pathway. So it goes from the spine to the reticular formation up in your brainstem, and then it gets into the thalamus. So it's multi-steps. Okay, it's not spine to thalamus. It goes to the spine, to the brainstem, and then from the brainstem, there's another set of neurons that goes all the way up into the thalamus. So there's a lot on this slide. I want you to go over this information on this slide over the weekend if you at all possibly can review it. And I'm hoping that it will become somewhat easier to understand as you go back and review. So one of the things that makes this spinal reticulothalamic tract really unique, one thing that's not unique, we have this multimodal group of neurons right sort of in the midline here. So this is like another wide dynamic range type of neuron. And what this is really useful for is that if we have a neuron that's responding here, it will actually send up information on both sides of the spinal cord. So it's a bilateral projection. It goes up both sides. It's not just going up one side. This is unique in the sense that the information from the right side will go up both the left and right side. The left side will also go up both the right and left side. So this is a bilateral projection, goes up into the reticular formation that's found in the brainstem. And what this does is that it will then take that information and then send it to another nucleus, again, making this unique, the central median nucleus of the thalamus. And this is a slow pain pathway. And again, that's sort of buried here for you. This is responsive to slow pain, burning pain. If you've been working out and you feel that throbbing in your muscles, or if you've got that sort of sunburn and that low sort of burning pain that's continuing on, it's that spinal reticulothalamic tract that's being activated. These fibers are being sent up bilaterally all the way to the brainstem, and then from the brainstem, it will then be sent up into the central median nucleus that you see here. It will also send some of that information to a different area, not to S1. It will send this information to another group of neurons known as the basal ganglia that we'll be talking about today. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about why things go wrong in the way that this is set up. So I told you about these wide dynamic range neurons. They receive input from A delta fibers, C fibers, A beta fibers, mechanoreceptors, pain receptors, temperature receptors. All of those are making synapses onto the same wide dynamic range neuron. And we're going to come back to and talk about these wide dynamic range neurons as sort of an issue. Before we get there, I need to talk to you about this phenomenon known as referred pain. And this is that artificial convergence where we have visceral nociceptors also making some projections onto spinal thalamic and spinal reticulothalamic neurons. Do you guys remember what visceral nociceptors are? What do they do? What do they tell you about? Sorry, altogether? No, altogether with the same answer. So what do? They give you information about your internal organs, right? When your internal organs are feeling pain, these are the ones that fire. How often do you feel your internal organs feeling pain? Very, very rarely, right? You guys are all young and very healthy, so you very rarely feel like your internal organs. I'm guessing that none of you have actually felt any pain in your kidneys, or you've never had like chest pains related to ischemia in your heart, etc. So we very rarely feel these nociceptors being activated from our internal organs because you're so incredibly healthy. But they send the same projections, the visceral receptors from your heart, the visceral receptors that innervate your kidneys, they send their same axons to the same level in the spinal thalamic tract. Normally, they don't do anything. They're quiet. They just sort of sit there and don't respond because there's no pain signals to be sending. However, your brain doesn't really know what to make of that information. Let's say suddenly you have pain coming from your kidney. It's never seen that kind of pain before. How does your brain interpret that signal? How would you interpret that signal? So you would interpret it the best way that you know how. So if I told you, for example, that you have a multiple choice test question, or you have multiple choice test tomorrow, you would probably be, based on your past experience, think about like what that multiple choice test might look like. Your brain does the same thing. It's never encountered this pain before, yet it's suddenly getting an impulse from that area, like the kidney or your heart, etc. It has no idea what that signal is supposed to represent. It's never encountered it before. That pain receptor, the pain receptors in this organ are signaling to that same neuron that you see here, the spinal thalamic tract neuron, that pain is coming from this internal organ. Your brain is trying to make sense of this information. It's never had this information available to it before. So what it does is it says, well, normally this neuron that sends a projection up into the thalamus and then up into the somatosensory cortex is coming from this patch of skin. Therefore, because I've never felt this before, it must be that patch of skin that normally I see information coming from. that actually is in pain. And so when your heart, for example, actually feels pain, maybe after a PSL midterm exam or whatever, so when your heart feels pain, the brain has no way to interpret that. So what it does is it sends a signal that your arm is feeling pain or your chest is feeling pain. If your kidneys are in pain, your body tries to represent that the best way that it can by saying that, like, your back really hurts. And so this is an example of convergence in the spinal thalamic and the spinal reticulothalamic tract, where a pain signal from a visceral receptor makes the same connection onto the same neuron, and your brain can't represent that correctly, so it actually fills in the gap and says, but it's normally innervated by this patch of skin, therefore that patch of skin must be the area that is in pain. So when your heart is feeling pain, this is the area on your skin that's normally also innervating that same neuron in the spinal thalamic tract. Your lungs and diaphragm, for example, when you have pain there, it's actually represented by pain in your neck, and so forth. So this is that idea that when we have convergence on the spinal thalamic and reticulothalamic tract neurons, it can become a problem. Here's another example of where it becomes a bit of a problem as well. So a couple of things that I want to point out to you here. This is that substantia gelatinosa, and in the substantia gelatinosa, which you see here, we have a lot of these inhibitory neurons, and this is how we represent inhibitory neurons, and we're going to see a lot of that today. And in addition, I'm also going to point out this Lissauer's tract, and this Lissauer's tract is where short little axonal projections are going to be sent up one or two layers above and below this layer in the spinal cord. So they're very short axonal tracts, okay? So just keep this in mind. So let's talk a little bit about what you're seeing here. So tell me a little bit about the C fiber that you see here. What can you tell me about the C fiber? What kind of information is it conveying, or could it possibly be conveying? So it's probably pain information, could be temperature, but for the time being, let's say it's pain information. It's burning pain. It's the type of pain that you know is going to be slow because it's a small unmyelinated axon. That's the C fiber. It's coming into the spinal cord, and it's coming in and making synapses onto this spinal thalamic cell, and the spinal thalamic cell is a wide dynamic range neuron because it's receiving multiple inputs, and you can see it's receiving multiple inputs because it's also receiving inputs, and this is the way that we represent inputs. Here's that C, it's making synapses onto this spinal thalamic wide dynamic range neuron. Here's that A beta. Tell me what you know about A beta. So is it large diameter, small diameter? So large diameter, is it myelinated, not myelinated? So it's myelinated, so it's fast information. It's associated with what type of receptor? It's a mechanoreceptor. So again, it could be a Meissner's corpuscle, it could be a Merkel's disc. And so what this is suggesting is we have both pain inputs going into this wide dynamic range neuron, and we also have these A beta fibers coming into this wide dynamic range neuron. And there's also this circuit that's in between in this substantia gelatinosa. So take a look at this circuit really carefully. This is that A beta mechanoreceptor that's coming in. This mechanoreceptor's axon is coming in and making a synapse onto this wide dynamic range neuron. No issues there. We've already talked about it, multimodal. So we have mechanoreceptive information, pain information, therefore wide dynamic range, multimodal, multi-senses coming in to the same neuron found in this spinal thalamic tract. But it's also making synapses at the same time onto these inhibitory neurons that we find here in the substantia gelatinosa. Think a little bit about this. One branch is going in, stimulating the wide dynamic range neuron, the spinal thalamic one, and the other one is going into the substantia gelatinosa and activating these inhibitory neurons. So we make use of this. This is what is known, and this is a classic theory. This is a theory that was developed by Martin Wall in the 1980s, saying that you can actually control the amount of pain that you actually feel at the level of the spinal cord. We can gate pain. This is called the gate control theory of pain at the level of the spinal cord. It was a revolutionary idea that somehow we could control pain levels by manipulating mechanoreceptors at the level of the spinal cord. And his idea is really simple, and it actually kind of works. So, for example, if you've been standing up all day and your back is kind of sore, your back feels better, for example, when you go in and get a massage done on your back. So why does your back start feeling better? It's not because you're moving around metabolites or anything else or getting rid of metabolites. The pain fibers are still firing, but what's happening is that the mechanoreceptors, when you're physically stimulating your back, the mechanoreceptors are coming in, sending in a signal onto the spinothalamic tract neuron, but also activating these inhibitory neurons to turn off the C fibers. There are other examples of this as well. So that's one example of mechanical gate control. A beta fibers, the mechanical stimulation of your back through a massage, turns off the pain response. Can you think of another way that you turn off your pain responses? Using the C fiber model, yes. So soaking your feet. Okay, I could buy that actually. So if you've been standing up all day and you've been soaking and your feet hurt, you might soak your feet. That would be a different way to do it. Probably not through the A beta pathway, but very similar idea. Anything else that you can think of with an A beta mechanoreceptor being activated? Sorry, taking a Tylenol? No, no. Let's use the old theory. Mechanoreceptor. You've hurt your thumb. What do you do? Yeah, so I don't know if you actually rub it, but some of you might kind of put it under your arm. Some of you might suck your thumb, whatever it is. That's the mechanical stimulation of the pain response that you're trying to lower or mediate. And it's because the mechanoreceptor is signaling through the substantia gelatinosa and turning off the response of the pain fiber that is coming in. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the itch and gastrin-related peptide receptor that might also be involved in your sensation of itch. But I do want you to make sure that you understand and can apply this gate control theory of pain. Mechanoreceptors gating the pain responses to the C fibers. Okay. I'm going to go and switch gears just a little bit, and I'm going to start talking to you about motor control systems. And this motor control system, and I'm using the lectures that were developed by Dr. Wojtowicz. It's one thing to actually sense all of this stuff. So I sense that something is hot. I sense that there's a lot of pressure on my arm. If you can't do anything about that, though, it becomes really, really problematic. And so we need to be able to do something with the sensory system information that's coming in, and this is what we're going to be talking about. The simplest form of movement is actually a reflex. It makes use of everything that we've talked about. So if you understand today's lecture, you're in really, really good shape for the upcoming term test because you've understood everything about the somatosensory system and you're going to understand everything about these reflexes. I'm going to give you 3 different examples of reflexes, and then we're going to talk about how these reflexes get built up, the particular properties of the spinal cord that allow for what's known as reciprocal inhibition, and we'll talk about very briefly presynaptic inhibition. So reflexes are the simplest form of movement. I told you at the very outset, and you don't have to worry about the next few slides, it's just to give you some background. We are born with a certain set of reflexes. These reflexes are adaptable. They are appearing and disappearing all the time. So when you are really small, this particular reflex that you see up here is a reflex that if you take a baby and you were to take the baby from a sitting position and then drop them all the way down, not quite dropping them, but just cradling them and making them feel like they're dropping, their arms kind of splay out and so do their legs. That is a reflex activity. It's not something they've ever learned. It happens when this happens to their particular physiology. And this is known as the Moro reflex, named after Ernst Moro, who was a pediatrician who described this reflex way back in the 19th century. And it's a consistent reflex. You lose this reflex. Most of you don't have this reflex around anymore. I'm hoping that most of you have lost this reflex. This is known as the rooting reflex. The rooting reflex disappears usually by the time you are about 3 months of age. And the rooting reflex is if you stimulate and you rub the side of a baby's face, they will turn their face toward the stimulus as a reflex. They haven't learned anything yet, and as a result, they'll begin this suckling reflex. I would argue that if you still had this kind of reflex every time someone kind of touched the side of your face, you would look really perverted, right? And it's not something that you probably have, and that's a good thing because we lose these reflexes all the time. And we also develop other reflexes. So think about this a little bit. We begin with these series of reflexes. These reflexes allow us to control muscles. Muscles allow limbs and different parts of our body to move, and we're born with some of these. We lose and adapt others of these as we get older. But think about this entire developmental line, okay? So at some point, you have to go from being completely immobile, almost immobile in terms of being able to move, to being able to stand upright by the time you are somewhere between 11 to 12 months, and then beginning the process of walking. All of these are actually a series of reflexes that you've been building up slowly that allow you to be able to do this. And again, these are developmental milestones, and you can see that there's a little bit of range, but overall, when you start being able to walk alone at about 11 months, that can range anywhere from 9 to 17 months, but there is a finite way in which we can actually track this, and these are developmental milestones, and again, you don't have to worry about these details. So these reflexes then become really, really important. We have been talking in this course really about all of this stuff here on the left. We've been talking about sensory feedback. How do these sensory systems work? What are the Meissner corpuscles there for? What do the Merkel discs do? What do the Pacinian corpuscles do? How do they signal? What part of the spinal cord do they send information up? What part of the brain do they then get to after the thalamus? But we really haven't talked about what's the result of that kind of pathway that goes up. And again, if you look at it really simplistically, some of this means that it goes right back into the spinal cord. It activates a motor neuron. This is a type of reflex that we'll see very commonly. It might actually go back and affect a central pattern generator that we'll be looking at in the brainstem as well as in the spinal cord, or it might go all the way back into the cortex to allow for you to decide what you're going to do with the information that's just come in from the sensory system. And we're going to be looking at this from the lowest level to higher levels as we go along. And there is a hierarchy. This is the lowest level here at the level of a reflex, and then the central pattern generators are the next level up in terms of complexity. But the highest level, the most complex level that we're going to take a look at is one that actually we don't understand everything about. We know the different structures and what they do, but we're still learning about these higher voluntary controls within the higher centers in your brain. So again, the simplest form of movement are these simple reflexes. A sensory neuron makes a direct synaptic connection onto a spinal cord motor neuron. You'll see lots of examples and you'll understand this. If we go in the spinal cord and we stay within the spinal cord, we will actually see that spinal cord neurons, a group of them in the lumbar region of your spinal cord and then another set in the brainstem, control rhythmic activity, the rhythmic movement of different muscles, like the same muscles that you're using over and over again on the same sort of basis. So again, think about it. You're breathing in and out, right? You're doing that in terms of a rhythm, and that rhythmicity is actually generated by these central pattern generators. You're breathing in and out at about 12 breaths per minute. That's a rhythmic activity. When you walk, your walking is a rhythmic activity where your right leg and left leg repeat itself over and over again. That's a rhythmic activity generated by these central pattern generators that we'll be talking about. But more complicated movements, the ones where you're consciously deciding that are not rhythmic, the ones that allow you to look at that door and then decide like how you're going to open it and then leave, are completely different. And this complex volitional movement, the voluntary movement that you decide on, involves a whole bunch of your brain. It involves the premotor cortex, the motor cortex, the ganglia, the cerebellum for fine control, and that becomes really, really complex. And we'll talk about that at the very end. So these reflexes are where we're going to start, and these are the basic elements of motor control. It's still a muscle, still a nerve, and it's still an activation, and it causes an effect. So there's a bending back of the of the sensory stimulus directly within the CNS to cause a motor response. A muscle has to contract, in other words. And oftentimes there's a specific task, whether it's generating force, whether it is changing your position or maintaining your position, staying upright, whatever it is, these are different types of reflexes. So I'm actually going to start with a little bit of nomenclature. I'm hoping it's not too simplistic for you. We've been spending a lot of time looking at these stimuli and these sensory receptors that you have on your skin. There's going to be a rationale that you'll understand today why we spent so much time talking about the mechanoreceptors, the A beta fibers, etc., starting today. So we've talked about how they send sensory information into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and what often happens is they will make a series of synapses, and this is a polysynaptic pathway. Here is the first synapse that you see here between the yellow and red, and then between the red interneuron and then the blue motor neuron, it is another synapse. So there are two synapses, okay? Every synapse that you have slows things down. Ideally, you would have like no synapses. It'd just be like direct. The sensory neuron causes motor activity. That can't happen in the nervous system. So the fastest reflexes that we have are monosynaptic. There's just one synapse between the neuron and the motor neuron. But this is polysynaptic. And eventually it will cause the target cell effector, in this case a striated muscle, to be able to contract. So this is an example of a typical reflex arc. There is a stimulus. Here it's a pain stimulus. The pain stimulus, again, involving these free nerve endings, might signal through the C fiber, sending information into the spinal cord, and then it will make a synapse before it actually causes the motor neuron to become activated. Now, what we've been doing is actually looking at the higher level end of things. So we've been looking at, well, this crosses over, it then sends up information on the lateral spinal thalamic tract, which is what you're seeing here. Definitely happens. But that doesn't help you in the short term, right? So you just put your hand on a tack. Do you want to have your brain analyze that? I think I'm feeling some pain. It might be a good idea for me to pull my hand back, or do you actually want to get that pain removed right away? So this path here on the left allows you to short circuit having to consciously think about what's happening. Like, I think I'm feeling attack under my arm, under my palm. I think I should move my hand away, and I think I should probably yell out in surprise that it hurts. All of that is volitional. But there is a reflex arc that you don't even think about, where if you've touched something that is painful, you're going to move your hand away. That reflex arc where you're not thinking about it is all at the level of the spinal cord. Again, just to make sure that it's all making sense to you, is this a monosynaptic or a polysynaptic pathway? So it's polysynaptic. There's a sensory neuron. The neuron in white in the middle is the first synapse, and then between the white and the motor neuron is the second synapse. So it is a polysynaptic pathway. So we've actually looked at this stretch reflex earlier. So we looked at what happens when you have a passive stretch of your muscle. A load is put on your hand or on your arm. It pulls your muscle down. You spring your muscle back. You contract it back. This is an example of a passive stretch reflex. And again, we've looked at where a load is put on the arm. And this is the response is, again, the active contraction of the muscle. It could be the bicep muscle. If you're looking at the knee jerk reflex, it might be the patellar tendon is being activated, and as a result, your leg kicks. It's also a stretch reflex as well. So this stretch reflex is very sensitive and extremely fast. Your colleagues were gracious enough to actually give this demonstration. This involves the sensory receptor being a muscle spindle within the biceps arm. And it is a monosynaptic connection. This is diagrammed for you in this particular slide. When you have a load put on your arm that you were not expecting, you're not going to drop it and you're going to hold it upright because your arm adjusts immediately. It is a reflex activity. And this stretch reflex is essential for stabilizing posture. So your legs have this same reflex. Without this reflex where you're able to balance different loads, you wouldn't actually be able to walk down a step because as you're changing the load that's on your leg muscles and you're not compensating for it, you're not going to contract your legs enough. But you're not physically thinking about trying to compute how much weight do I actually have to keep up. It's a reflex that's occurring automatically. And so these stretch reflexes are there not just in your arms, also in your legs, very important for maintaining your posture. And in fact, your leg muscles are where this happens the most. The shortest latencies where you have a load and then the immediate response is about 25 milliseconds in your arms, about 37 milliseconds in your ankle extensors. It also runs parallel on multiple levels in your spinal cord, and you can see this is a monosynaptic connection. Here is the muscle spindle in your arm that is getting stretched out. It sends a signal in. There are no other synaptic connections. There's no interneuron. It fires directly on the motor neuron, and it will cause the muscle to contract. Okay. During movement, though, this reflex has to be suppressed. So we don't need your leg to be locking up. You don't need your arm to be like locking up. You need it to be mobile and you need it to be adaptive. Not shown on here is there's a branch that is also going up and going in toward the cortex, and there is a transcortical path. So you could, for example, if reflexes were the only thing that dominated your life, if someone put something in your hand that you actually didn't want in your hand, you could decide to drop it, right? If it was just a reflex, you would still be holding it. But you have this ability because of the transcortical voluntary pathway, not shown on this diagram, to actually override this reflex if you really wanted to. This Golgi tendon reflex, again, looks at active tension in the muscle. If your muscle is actually contracting, how do I make sure it's not over-contracting, in other words? And what happens is it actually causes the relaxation or the reduction of tension in the muscle as a result. So this involves having afferents at the level of the tendon, seeing that there's pressure being put on the tendon. It fires through the 1B afferents and it makes synapses onto interneurons in the intermediate zone on the spinal cord that I'll show you next. And these 1B interneurons then will inhibit the alpha motor neurons in the same muscle. So when you are, for example, controlling the amount of contraction you have in your biceps when you're like bringing a cup up toward your lips, you will be using this Golgi tendon. So this Golgi tendon prevents movement, and that becomes really confusing. So let's put it as over movement, like not moving too much. Okay, so this Golgi tendon reflex prevents you from like driving a cup like directly too hard into your face, or like throwing things over your head if you're making use of the stretch reflex. It's also working with the stretch reflex to stabilize posture. Here is what we've been talking about. This 1B is coming in. It is making a series of connections on these interneurons that you find here to work on a series of muscles. Now, I'm going to come back to that. For the time being, I only need you to know that it's polysynaptic, which I hope you understand from this, that it's a polysynaptic reflex, and we'll come back and talk about that in a moment. Any questions about this before we go on break? Okay, so why don't we take a break now? If you have any questions, come up, ask, and I'll be happy to try to go through them. It's okay. Okay, folks, if you don't mind, I'm going to get going. Um, I told you that we were going to go through three different types of reflexes, and we just went through the stretch reflex as an example of a monosynaptic reflex. I hope everyone's okay up there. And then this other reflex that involves a noxious or painful stimuli is another example of a reflex. In this case, again, we're always looking for stimulus, the response. We're looking for the pathways that are involved, if it's multisynaptic or monosynaptic, and then if there are other parts of the spinal cord that get involved in this. So again, the stimulus here for flexion withdrawal reflex is a noxious or painful injury to the limb. So you can imagine, for example, you are having one too many drinks, and maybe you pass your arm over an open flame on a candle, and this part of your skin may end up burning, or it may be really, really painful. And this would be that noxious injury. The response is actually somewhat complicated, though. It's not as easy as you would like to think. Everyone would say automatically, yeah, you'll move your arm away. That's true. So part of the response is exactly the way that you would think that it would occur. There is what is known as a flexion. It is, after all, the flexion withdrawal reflex. It's the flexion of the joint that is proximal or nearest to the stimulus. So if it's like right here in the middle of my arm, the thing that I'm going to do is to flex it back. I'm going to try to withdraw it away from that painful stimulus. That's that flexion response, and that makes total sense. However, you're also going to see, and this gets a little bit more complicated and it's not in this particular diagram, you're also going to see that you're going to have extension distal to the site of injury. So not only do you have flexion, you move your arm away, but as you're doing so, as you're moving it away, the distal parts are going to actually extend, which is why you see the fingers extending out. So this flexion withdrawal actually involves flexion of the joint proximal to the stimulus, but also extension from the part that is farther away. This signals initially through those pain fibers, whether it's the A delta, the small myelinated, or the small unmyelinated C nociceptor afferents, that will then signal back into the superficial layer of the spinal cord that you see here, and then through multiple interneurons. So here is interneuron 1, here is interneuron 2, activate this motor neuron to cause these different effects. And again, it's a gross oversimplification. There are obviously multiple muscle groups that are involved, but it gives you an idea of how quickly and why this reflex actually occurs. And again, it's a multisynaptic pathway, and that's something, again, you should make sure that you know. Generally speaking, one of the ways that I like asking these types of questions to make sure that you know and understand the differences is I might ask you, like, which of the following types of reflexes involved multiple interneurons. Some reflexes do, some reflexes don't. So as you're going along, you might want to jot those types of details down in your notes. So when we started this series, one of the things that we looked at was the overall structure of the spinal cord. I know it's been like a week and a half, almost 2 weeks now, but if we go back to the very first lecture that I gave you, we looked at the spinal cord. We saw the white matter on the outside, the gray matter on the inside. We saw the dorsal horns where sensory information is coming in, and the ventral horns that contain the motor neurons that cause activity, the efferents going out. And one of the regions that I talked very, very briefly about and told you didn't have to know at the time was this intermediate zone, stuck right in the middle, right between the dorsal and ventral horns. And this intermediate zone is actually really important in our discussion today. And you need to keep this straight as we're going along, not just in this section, but the sections that come afterwards. In that intermediate zone region, stuck right in the middle of the spinal cord between the dorsal and ventral horns, one of the basic properties of neurons that are found in this intermediate zone is what is known as reciprocal inhibition. And what that means is that when you are turning on one group of neurons, at the same time you're turning off another group of neurons. We're going to see how that's important in locomotion. We're going to see how that becomes important when you start talking about reflexes. And what this means is if you are turning on the flexor motor neurons, for example, the ones that we just looked at, you cause flexion, you cause the muscles to actually contract here, and it causes you to flex. That also means that if you activated this, you actually had to turn off the other group of neurons, group of muscles that actually would cause extension. So activation of the flexors means that you also at the same time had to have turned off the antagonistic extensors. So for you to be able to flex and extend, and I really apologize, I wish I lifted a lot more, it'd be much more impressive, I know, but as you flex and then you extend, there are separate groups of muscles that are allowing you to flex, and you have to turn off the extensors, and when you extend, you have to activate the extensors. Wow, it's a lot of flab down here, eh? And then you have to actually turn off the flexors. So this involves that intermediate group of neurons that turn one group of muscles off when you need this type of movement. However, in certain cases, for example, if you want to be standing a long period of time, you don't want to be turning these off. So there is actually a mechanism where this circuit can be suppressed. And we'll see parts of that circuit later on today. So this basic property, intermediate zone, contains neurons that generally have this reciprocal inhibitory pattern. So here's that reciprocal inhibition that I talked to you about earlier. So in this particular example, you should actually be able to tell me some of these different details. So first, what is the stimulus that's coming in? So it's an A delta and C fiber. So automatically you know it's what kind of information? Probably pain information because it's both A delta and C. If it was just C only, it would be really hard for you to tell, but it's A delta, pain fibers, and then the C. So probably pain information, and you can see it coming in. Here is that interneuron, and this interneuron that's found in this intermediate zone, it's not in the dorsal root, and it's not in the ventral root, it's right sort of in the middle. This is actually sending a projection to the flexor, it's activating the flexor, but then take a look at what's happening here. There is another neuron in the intermediate zone that is at the same time causing an inhibition of the extensor. So let's take a look at what would have happened. So if you were causing activation of this neuron, it would come in, it would signal to this neuron here found in the intermediate zone, and it would start to signal to turn on the flexors. It would activate the flexor muscles, which causes your arm to flex. But at the same time, the same signal that's getting sent here, that same signal is activating this inhibitory neuron, which is turning off the extensor. So that same neuron that you're finding here has this property of activating one group of muscles and through reciprocal inhibition at the level of the intermediate zone, turning off the antagonistic other group of muscles. Does that make sense to everyone? So if it doesn't make sense, make sure that you're spending time going over it. Hopefully you'll see that this activating this one neuron in the middle will activate both your flexors and through this inhibitory neuron turn off your extensors. And again, it's a noxious stimulus. You're exciting your flexor muscles, and via reciprocal inhibition, stopping the extensors from firing. So again, in this particular example that you're seeing here, this is a classic example of what type of stimulus? Or what kind of reflex are we looking at here? So this is the knee-jerk reflex. This is an example of a passive stretch. This is a great example of a passive stretch. You're sitting there, and your physician just wants to know if you have normal reflexes. They tap on the patella, the small bone at the front of your knee, and when you do that, when you tap that, it actually pulls on the muscle, so it's a passive stretch on the muscle. And if it works well, you'll actually get a small kick. It's not at this exaggerated kick, but your leg will kind of move really in a jerky motion. And so what happens is, this is a passive stretch. It is activating the stretch reflex here. It is sending a signal back, but it's also causing the inhibition through this same intermediate zone neuron. It's actively turning off the hamstring muscle at the same time. So you turn on the quadricep muscle that you see here that causes contraction, but you also have to inhibit at the same time that you are exciting the quadricep. You have to have reciprocal inhibition of the hamstring muscle. So it's another example of reciprocal inhibition. Any questions on this before we go on? No? So again, if you're taking a look at this, it gets even more complicated. Okay, so this is an example of what's known as crossed extension. So we've looked at this pathway several times now, this A delta C fiber pathway, where we know that you're getting a pain stimulus. If you step on a tack, you'll withdraw your foot right away. You'll get that flexion of that foot. So it flexes. You know that there's going to be inhibition of the extensor. The flexor muscles are going. But here's the thing. When you are standing upright, you need to stay standing upright. How does your body know? It's a reflex. You're not thinking about it. Again, reflex by definition, you don't have to think about it. If you just stepped on something, you don't have to tell your other leg to bear more weight. How does your other leg know? Because it's received no sensory information. There's been no time for it to get up to your brain at all. How does it know to bear more weight when you are having a pain stimulus on the other foot? So this is inside the spinal cord. At the level of the intermediate zone, we also have this cross extension. So we have this flexion withdrawal that you're seeing here. The flexor muscles are being activated, and this is that pathway that you're seeing here. And this is that interneuron that we looked at earlier. There would be another branch going to the extensor muscles, but you can also see that there is a branch going over to the opposite leg, the contralateral leg. And this involves the contralateral extension. The other leg has to be able to extend more when you have this flexion response. And the group of neurons, the group of axons that actually carry information from one side of the spinal cord to the other is exactly the same name that we give it in the brain. And these are known as commissural interneurons. So these are interneurons. Whenever you see them, if you see them again on term test, you'll know that they're taking information from the right side to the left side, or from the left side to the right side. And these carry information to the contralateral spinal cord. So that's the way, and that's the reason why the reflex works the way that it does. It has nothing to do with your brain processing this really quickly. Your spinal cord has processed all of that for you on the spot, and as a result, it is this reflex. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I'm not going to ever give you a question, by the way, that is this complicated. I would have a really hard time sitting there on the exam trying to work out like what muscles are being activated. I wouldn't give you a diagram either. It would be really unfair to do so. But if you really understand what I've just told you about what happens when you step on a painful stimulus, and you should be able to work out what's going on in this particular diagram related to cross extension, be able to go back on this diagram and tell me where these commissural interneurons are, and what sorts of things are happening in the other leg, or the contralateral leg. And again, I'll leave that for you to go over and work through. If you ever want to drop by and make sure that you are on the right track, feel free to do so. Again, I won't ever give you this type of complicated diagram or a really complicated scenario like this, but it's something that if you understand it, you should use it as your own self-diagnostic to see if you can work out what's going on here. So another type of reflex that's going to be really important in a few minutes is this extensor thrust reflex. And this is extensor thrust reflex is if you put pressure on the sole of your foot, and it doesn't have to be like a really strong type of pressure. It's just innocuous, just every day standing on the sole of your foot. That's enough pressure. Again, because you're activating mechanoreceptors that are going to be firing up through the A beta fibers, so relatively large myelinated fibers, really fast conduction time, they will project to these intermediate zone interneurons here that will activate and turn on these extensor motor neurons. Usually, this only takes place, this extensor thrust through the A beta fibers only takes place during the stance phase. So if you're standing here, you're activating this stance receptor, you're activating automatically the extensor motor neurons and the muscles that are involved in this. Keep this in mind, because we're going to come back and use this reflex when we talk about walking. So walking is a series of reflexes that you built up over time. Since the time that you were born and the time that you started standing up, you started making use of and developing your repertoire of these reflexes, and you'll see why I mean that in a few minutes. So this is normally we get this type of reflex, this extensor thrust reflex is influenced very heavily by the corticospinal tract. So there's a descending tract. It comes from the brain down through the spinal cord to the level of the motor neurons. It's a descending corticospinal tract. Usually we see it on the lateral parts of the spinal cord. We talked about it in passing previously. And this extensor thrust reflex that allows you to stand up when you have pressure on the soles of your feet can also be influenced by a descending pathway from your brain. In theory, it can also be elicited at rest. So if you vigorously stroke the foot, you can actually elicit this kind of response. If you are a normal individual, you haven't been standing around all day, and you have a normal corticospinal tract, when you take someone's foot, the bottom of their foot, and then you like really draw a C on the bottom of it, like really strongly, you'll actually see their foot kind of get into this uh, anti-gravity or extensor type of response, because they're feeling pressure on their foot, in other words, and they're trying to get their foot to break or to step down on it. If, however, you have damage to the corticospinal tract, it could happen because you have a spinal cord injury. You might have a stroke in one of the tracts in the corticospinal tract. You can actually see this neurologically. So neurologists will actually go in if they suspect that there is spinal cord damage. So you're in an automobile accident. That's actually the #1 cause of spinal cord injury. You're driving along, you get hit from behind. It actually causes the seat to push into your spinal cord and damages it. If they want to know if you have damage to the corticospinal tract, they'll induce this type of action on the sole of your foot. And if you don't have the normal extension profile, you have what's known as a Babinski sign, or the Babinski withdrawal reflex. Your toes actually curl back the opposite way. You can imagine if you're trying to stand, having your toes curling back wouldn't allow you to stand really well. And so this reflex pattern is actually switched from extension to a flexion response. So this again involves a number of different pathways. In theory, you might have, for example, a descending corticospinal tract pathway that comes in and affects the way in which these reflexes work or get strengthened. And one of these mechanisms might involve presynaptic inhibition. You might want to reroute how one motor nucleus or one group of motor neurons is activated. You might want to disinhibit or turn off the inhibition in another. And we'll see that presynaptic inhibition is another mechanism that's really powerful in terms of how we use different muscle groups. So you don't have to worry about this diagram. It's just there for you. It's actually really complex. The corticospinal tract actually allows you to turn off certain motor groups at any given point in time. You can decide which ones to be able to turn off through these descending pathways, either through presynaptic inhibition, completely turning off groups of motor neurons, etc. And it's just to give you an idea of how complex this whole pathway actually can be. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these next few reflexes, and to be honest, I'm not going to test you on these few reflexes. I'd rather you kind of go back and jog your memory a little bit, because the other parts that are associated with it you'll likely see on your final exam. But the information on this and the vestibulo-ocular reflex, just sort of sit back, try to remember as much as possible about these different pathways. So when you talk about the vestibulospinal reflex, the purpose of this reflex is to stabilize the body as much as possible. If you've ever tried balancing on a leg and then tried turning your head, it's really hard to balance. And this is because of things like the vestibulospinal reflex. If you start turning your head downwards, you're going to be activating those otolith organs. Do you remember those otolith organs from your sense of balance? So those get activated when you start rotating your head. And one of the reflexes that occurs is if you are starting to turn your head and you can't keep your balance, is to extend your leg in the direction in which you are activating these otolith afferents. The best place to actually see this is if you are looking at those speed skaters on that short track, and you see them coming around the turn, and they're putting their head down, they're extending their leg as far as they can. It's not just to give them more speed, it's because of this vestibulospinal reflex that they're actually extending their leg on the opposite side to where their head is turned. Again, just something for you to think a little bit about the otolith organs, your sense of balance, to put it into some physiological context. You don't have to worry about information on this coming back on your final exam. Or your term test or final exam. The vestibulo-ocular reflex is another one of these where you're actually turning your head. It involves angular rotation of your head. And what this is really useful for is if you are trying to keep your gaze on something as you're like turning your head. So if you are trying to fixate something on the back of your retina as your head is moving, this vestibulo-ocular reflex allows you to keep your gaze centered on something even though your head is turning. And this will work even if your eyes are moving in the opposite direction of where your head is going. And this is that vestibular-ocular reflex. If you're really interested and really fascinated by something in your field of view, even though your head is moving, this is a reflex that will become activated. You don't have to consciously think about it. And again, we won't go into this because it's part of the vestibular-ocular reflex, but this is the way in which it works. Your head is relatively heavy, your eyes are relatively light. In order for you to keep your gaze on something, there's actually the coordination of a number of different muscles that have to be involved, and the vestibular-ocular reflex keeps all of those on the same page. And again, we won't go into details about how the different neck muscles, the head muscles, and your eye muscles are coordinated for this vestibular-ocular reflex. So I just went through a whole bunch of different things, some of which you need to know, some of which you don't. Do you have any questions before we get into central pattern generators? So that's the end of the reflexes, the simplest form of movement, a bending back of sensory information at the level of the spinal cord. All of this is at the level of the spinal cord, every last reflex. Now we're moving into more complicated things within the spinal cord. Any questions before we go on? No? Okay, so I'm going to take you through a couple of things related to central pattern generators, their function, how this works when you start moving or locomotion, and the different aspects of body part movement during locomotion as well. And I'll touch very briefly on this concept of presynaptic inhibition again as we go through. So reflexes are really great. They help you on the short term, but they're not very complicated movements. All you're doing is like, there's a painful stimulus, I'm withdrawing my hand. I'm standing, I'm just gonna stay standing. They don't really do any complex types of movement at all. In order for you to start making more complicated movements, and the next complicated movement is a repetitive cyclical movement, and that's what I'm gonna be talking to you about, you need groups of neurons that actually can help you with this type of cyclical movement. So again, why are these not so useful? So a stretch reflex actually doesn't do anything to restore postural stability after you've encountered like a weight on your leg or anything else. You need a more centrally coordinated response. And some of this is at the level of these central pattern generators. We only see them in few places in the brain. We see them, for example, in the spinal cord. We see them at the level of the brainstem. These are all involved in the same rhythmic, cyclical activity. We will also see this later in the hypothalamus, where you have cyclical activity related to a higher brain circuit, and we still consider those to be central pattern generators. And we activate these central pattern generators usually from the bottom up. So we usually operate them in the order in which we need them or the order of relevance, and they're incredibly important in things like locomotion as well as in motor control. And we're going to start from the bottom, and we're going to work our way up to the top. And it kind of sounds like a Drake song, which is really, really cool. So we're going to work our way upwards. We're going to start off with the central pattern generators in the lumbar part, so it only controls your legs. And there is another smaller group up here that control your arms, the cervical group, but we won't really concentrate too much on them. So locomotion and walking is really a cyclical activity. You take one leg, you lift it, you put it down, you take your other leg, lift it, put it down. It's repeated over and over again. It's a cyclical activity. And this is known as the leg step cycle or the step cycle of walking. And it's literally the same process repeated over and over again. And what happens is there is a network of neurons, and again, they're found in the intermediate zone region. So the region between the dorsal horn and the ventral horn. I told you that they have some unique properties associated with them. One of these in the lumbar spinal cord is that they form a network, and this network actually has both pacemaker activity. It generates a rhythm, in other words, and they also have diffuse excitation. So they start off being relatively quiet, they become more and more active, then they start becoming really active, and then we'll see that they can turn themselves off. The other thing that makes these groups of central pattern generators that are found in the lumbar cord in the intermediate zone is they also exhibit reciprocal inhibition. Do you remember me talking to you about reciprocal inhibition in the intermediate zone? These are in the intermediate zone. These neurons exhibit reciprocal inhibition, and they will also be phase dependent in terms of reflexes. So at some point, you need to flex your leg. You have to actually bring it up. At some point, you actually have to extend your leg and activate the extensor thrust reflex. You're standing on your one leg very briefly for a few milliseconds. You need that extensor thrust reflex. So you need to have these reflexes being activated in this series as you are walking. And again, we're going to see that your leg, no matter what we do, in the spinal cord, it gets programmed as these steps. You are swinging your leg out, you are standing, or the stance phase. All of these involve different types of reflexes. So you're going to be flexing your leg muscle during the swing phase. You'll get where you are into the extension phase, where you're putting the heel down, you'll stand very briefly on it, and then you'll swing your other leg, and it repeats over and over. So these are the different things that we'll be talking about, flexion as well as extension. You don't have to worry about the bullet point about the reticular formation just yet. I'll tell you more about that in a few moments. So these central pattern generators that are in the intermediate zone that control how your legs move in a cyclical pattern are organized as these two half centers. And these half centers are unique for each leg. So you have a half center for your right leg, and on the other side of your spinal cord, you have a half center for your left leg. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you about one side because it makes it a little easier. So if you were to take a look at the central pattern generator, we have a group of neurons as one half, known as a flexor burst generator network. Okay, and this flexor burst generator network drives the flexion of the flexor motor nuclei, the ones that are actually going to cause your leg to flex. These are the groups that are going to be involved in flexion. It lifts the legs and then it turns itself off. And that's its major job. That is the central pattern generator, the half center in the spinal cord that's involved in this. The extensor burst is a separate group of neurons, a separate group of networked neurons that are involved in the extension. They drive the extensors, they will activate the extensor motor nuclei, and they will drive extension. So again, there's this idea of reciprocal inhibition. When you are activating the flexors, you can't activate the extensors. They reciprocally inhibit each other. So when one is on, it turns the other one off. And that's this idea of reciprocal inhibition or mutual inhibition. However, there's this other interesting property associated with it as well. They are both spontaneously active when they are not inhibited. So as long as you're not being inhibited, you're going to be active. So keep all these 3 points in mind as we go through this in a little bit more detail. So the flexor burst generator, the flexion phase of your leg swing actually has a fixed duration. If you are walking faster, it's really the amount of time that you're extending that you're shortening. The flexion part, the part where you're actually swinging your leg, you can't really do much about it. During walking, if you're talking about running, none of this applies, but even if you're speed walking, it still applies exactly the same way. You're just shortening the extension phase. And again, if you go back and you're looking very carefully at this, and you don't have to, again, worry too much about this, the extension phase where you see E, it actually makes up most of your step cycle of walking. So this flexion leg swing has a fixed duration. Doesn't matter how fast you're doing the actual walking. As long as it's walking, It's always fixed. When you're running, it's completely different. Both feet are leaving the ground at some point, so it's a very different type of activity. This flexor network has a buildup of inhibition that actually stops the bursts of action potentials. In other words, it has a way of turning itself off. Okay, I'm going to get to that in the next diagram. Just hold on to this bullet point, follow with me on the next diagram, and hopefully it will make some more sense. The reciprocal inhibition of the extensor burst network, as this is turning itself off, stops, and that means that the extensor network becomes active. Remember, reciprocal inhibition. So I'm going to try to take you through this diagram in the next slide. This represents the half center for, let's say, the left leg. So these are the CPGs. We're only looking at this one side, and this one side has the intermediate zone. Remember, we have reciprocal inhibition in the intermediate zone, and we have one group over here called the flexor burst generators, which will activate the flexor motor neurons that cause leg flexion. And then we have the other one over here called the extensor burst generator that, when active, will cause the extension of your leg by activating these extensor motor neurons. So far, so good, right? Nothing too complicated there. So what happens is, this is always active. They're always turning on and off. And one of the things that happens is that this flexor burst generator will start having diffuse excitation. It will start building up and start firing action potentials, and it will eventually cause these flexor motor neurons to become excited and cause the motor neurons to fire. Your muscles will contract. Okay, again, nothing new there, hopefully, that these flexor burst neurons will do that. But take a look at what is happening. This flexor burst neuron, as it starts increasing the amount of activity that it has and eventually fire action potentials to activate this group of neurons, will actually have a branch that will go to this interneuron that is situated nearby. So as it turns itself on more and more, it's actually going to be activating this neuron more and more as well. This neuron is an inhibitory neuron. So as it is activating this flexor motor neuron through increased activity, it's actually finding a way to turn itself off, which is what this point is actually making. So this flexor network, through this inhibitory interneuron that you see here, is actually building up its own inhibition. Eventually, when it's turning on this group of flexor motor neurons, it's going to be turning itself off. So flexion has occurred. Now there's too much excitation. This interneuron that you see here at the top actually will turn off this flexor burst. No more flexion occurs. Hopefully that will make some sense to you. So on top of that, up until this point in the intermediate zone, this has been reciprocally inhibiting this extensor burst generator. Up until now, it has been doing a great job of turning this off. However, now it has just turned itself off, right? So it's flexed, it's done its thing, the flexor burst generator, it has turned itself off through this inhibitory interneuron, and this inhibition now has disappeared. Without this inhibition keeping it in place, now this extensor burst generator on the right actually now becomes active. So flexion has stopped, and it has stopped itself. Now in the intermediate zone, this extensor burst generator is now allowed to run rampant. It turns itself on, and it starts to actually excite these extensor motor neurons. And this is how the step cycle of walking works for that one leg. So for the left leg, there's a buildup of excitation. It turns itself off because of its own self-inhibition, and then the extensor motor neurons turn on in that same leg. I haven't shown this on this diagram, but I just want to know, because if you can tell me this answer, it's actually a good sign that maybe some of that has gotten through. This is only for one leg. How would you send information to the other leg about what's going on in this leg? What sort of fibers would you use? So you would use interneurons, and what are those interneurons called? So those commiseral interneurons would also be communicating with this half center as well. And there's all sorts of information coming in about propriospinal information about balance. There is tonic excitation to activate these neurons all the time, and we'll talk about the tonic excitation a little bit later. But we need to be able to match this with some sensory control. We need to be able to make sure that as we're walking along, that if we're encountering like little dips in the path ahead of us, that our leg is able to compensate. And so we need to have this sensory input, and that's on this previous diagram, this sort of sensory input coming in from foot pressure, from the cutaneous receptors, your joint receptors. All of this feeds into how much you should be turning these things on and turning these things off. So the sensory control is really important. Because it's all at the level of the spinal cord, this is really quick. It's at the level of reflexes. You don't have to think about it. You suddenly have hit a little divot in the ground ahead of you. You're going to be extending a little bit more than you normally do. You don't have to think about it. That sensory control is at the reflex level to allow for more extension to occur. It also provides these sensory cues when it's appropriate to actually begin the next leg swing. So imagine like you've just walked up to the edge of a cliff. You wouldn't want to keep going. You need those sensory cues to actually say and tell the central pattern generators when to continue and when it's not safe to be able to continue. So this transition to the leg swing is when that extension phase stops, and this disinhibits the flexor burst generator. Remember, they're reciprocally inhibiting each other. This only happens if the leg itself is not bearing weight, the other hip is extended, and the opposite leg is in the stance phase and is capable of bearing weight. And these cross projections that you just told me are commiseral fibers actually allow for this phase linking of CPGs to take place. Your left and right legs have to know at all times what's going on. It's just not one leg doing its own thing. The crossed projections, commiseral interneuron fibers are allowing this communication to take place. So for most normal people, you also use arm swings that are associated with walking, right? So once in a while, you kind of encounter people, they don't really swing their arms when they're walking. They can still walk, but actually it's a lot better for your upper body balance if you actually match and phase link your arm swings with your leg swings. And these also involve a very small group of central pattern generators. They're not at the level of the lumbar cord. The lumbar controls your legs. The cervical control your arms. So you have central pattern generators. We don't use them as often, but the central pattern generators in your cervical cord program the motion of arms during walking, and the flexion phase in the arm is synchronous with the contralateral flexion in the leg. So it's when you're flexing the left leg, the right arm is flexing, in other words, and when you're flexing the left arm, the right arm is flexing. I don't think most normal people don't do sort of the same-sided walking, right? It would kind of look a little odd. And so this is to balance out any torsion or twisting in your upper body as you're doing this. And again, all of this phase linking occurs because now you can't have projections going from one side of the leg to the other. In order for your arm and leg to know what's going on, like your arm has to be phase locked with your leg, there's a separate tract that I'd like you to make sure that you know, and it's highlighted for you. This propriospinal tract actually links one segment of the spinal cord, the lumbar, to the next segment, which is the cervical. So what your arm and leg communicate with each other is through this propriospinal tract. Okay, and make sure that you go back, review this in terms of communicating from one side of the spinal cord to the other. That's a commiseral fiber. Communicating from one segment of the spinal cord to another is this propriospinal tract. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a couple of slides related to upper body balance, and this actually becomes somewhat important in terms of some of the nuclei that I'm going to introduce to you. So because we're bipedal, because we're standing upright, we actually have to maintain both the upper body as well as the head in a relatively stable position as we're walking. So again, it may sound really, really trivial, but actually the last bullet point that you see there it's not trivial. So when you see people that have suffered damage or a stroke, and you know that they actually can't control their upper body or their head while they're walking, they actually require a lot more assistance. So all of this, the control of your upper body as you're walking, and it's very, very unstable, and your head as you're walking, which is also really unstable, requires a number of these central pattern generators that are found at the level of the brainstem. Because remember, we talked about that. We have ones that are in the lumbar cord, and then these other up in the brainstem. These central pattern generators up here in the brainstem actually help us with our posture. They will send projections back down to make sure that the back muscles, the ones that are involved in your trunk support and everything else, they're contracting at the right time to make sure that your body isn't leaning forward too much or leaning back too much as you're walking. And again, it sounds really trivial because you're not thinking about it. Your central pattern generators in your brainstem are doing all the thinking for you. But if you're like leaning back or leaning forward as you're walking, you're not going to be doing very much walking. It's going to be very, very unstable. You're going to be falling. And these are the groups of neurons that you see in the medulla that act as these central pattern generators. And we're going to come back to this gigantocellular nucleus in a little bit. There are other ones like the nucleus reticularis and the pontus caudalis as well that are involved. We know that if you suffer a spinal cord injury, those individuals that have spinal cord injury where they can't have these projections coming down because they've damaged the anterior part of their spinal cord, and they send their projections down to control the contraction of your back muscles, they can't. So they require a lot of support while they're walking, or they have to have a brace while they're walking, and we know that upper body balance is really important as well. And we won't worry about the spinal reticulothalamic tract in terms of large body regions. Again, we won't worry too much about this either. It's the next slide that I really want to get to and to start talking to you about. But as you're walking, your head is actually doing a lot of movement. And because your head weighs about 6 to 8 pounds, it's actually a lot of weight for it to not be directly on top of your spinal cord. So your head actually has to be compensated for quite a bit, and the head angles have to be compensated for a lot during the time that you're walking in order to try to maintain it as close as possible to the midline. And it does so by contracting muscles in your neck, in your upper body through a combination of inputs from the visual system, vestibular system, the proprioceptive system, to make sure that the head is relatively stable as you're walking. Otherwise, it would really be moving around too much. Okay, so just before I get into the next section, did you have any questions about what I just chatted to you about? Some slides being a little bit more important. As you're going back and reviewing this weekend for the upcoming term test, as well as making notes that you'll have to try to remember all the way at the very end in your final exam, make sure that you're spending time on the step cycle of walking. Make sure that you understand how these different half centers for extension and flexion work, and that you know the properties of things that are found in the intermediate zone of the spinal cord, because these central pattern generators are always found in that intermediate zone. Okay, so we're going to start talking about this one region known as the mesencephalic locomotory region. I'm going to often abbreviate this sort of as the MLR. And this is an area, the mesencephalon is also called the midbrain. And this mesencephalon or midbrain locomotory region is the switch. So this is like, it's one thing to talk about central pattern generators. Remember, we're going in a hierarchy. Reflexes really are useful, but they don't do very much for you in terms of actual movement or anything else. These central pattern generators are really useful, but how do you actually turn on these central pattern generators? Like, how do you actually begin the process of walking? Like, you're not walking all the time. What gets you to start walking? There is a midbrain switch known as the mesencephalic locomotory region that turns on the reticulospinal locomotory CPGs, the ones that I was just showing to you. And these in turn activate those central pattern generators that exist within the spinal cord. So we have a descending series, in other words, this mesencephalic region here, which will then send projections to these reticulospinal locomotory CPGs, and these were shown for you here. I told you to remember this gigantocellular nucleus, and it will send a projection to this gigantocellular CPG, and then eventually this will activate the lumbar cord CPGs that initiate that step cycle of walking. So it's really this midbrain switch that turns on another CPG, that turns on another CPG, that eventually leads to the step cycle of walking. When we want to be walking faster, we actually increase the number of impulses or action potentials that come from the mesencephalic locomotory region. This is the group of neurons that actually provides the background drive to start the entire step cycle of walking. There is no pattern generation there. The pattern generation occurs at the level of the spinal cord. It just gets the ball rolling. Once the ball gets rolling, and you get this cycle going, you can speed things up, but the cycle itself is not something that is inherent in the mesencephalic locomotory region. Okay. Again, we won't worry too much about the next few slides for your own information. Again, for you to be able to maintain an upright stance, you have to have all sorts of input to make sure that your head is stable, but also in terms of your ability to just maintain your upper body in a stable position. Some of it's proprioceptive information, vestibular information, and visual information. All of those are cues to be able to keep your body in an upright position. I told you earlier on, I'm not going to concentrate on the vestibular ocular reflex, so you don't have to worry about this slide. We're going to come back to some of these different nuclei later on in the course, and this superior colliculus is an area where you get the coordination of head movement as well as visual the movement of your eyes, and this superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus are reflexes that we'll come back to when we talk about the autonomic pattern generators a little bit later on. Okay, so I'm just going to take you through two more slides, then we'll take a break. Then we'll get into some more complex types of movements. It's very rare that I'm going to ask you actually to go through and memorize some definitions. This section, because I know that you probably haven't had it before, you need to be pretty comfortable with a couple of definitions, like what a motor unit is, what a synergy is, and I want you to make sure that you spend some time going over these different definitions. So a synergy is the way that we're going to define it as a group of muscles that are all going to be contracting together for a particular purpose. So there might be a group of muscles, a synergy that's involved in reaching for and grasping a door handle. There might be another group of muscles or a synergy that's involved in actually turning that doorknob handle. Those different muscle groups are all working together to serve a similar function, and that's a synergy, though all of those groups of muscles that are working together. These are organized by that reticulospinal tract, that group that I just showed you, including the gigantocellular nucleus. And again, they're really important for postural muscle support. So when we're talking about all the groups of muscles that are involved in keeping you upright, those synergies are controlled by the reticulospinal tract, the reticulospinal tract being the previous diagram that I just showed you. And if you're talking about synergies that are very, very localized for fine motor movement and control of specific muscle groups, like how you're pointing, how you're playing the piano, how you're doing fine motor activity, not whole big muscles like on your back moving, but fine muscles in your arms and fingers, then we're talking about rubrospinal synergies as well as corticospinal synergies. Ones that are controlled by the corticospinal tract and muscle groups that are controlled by the rubrospinal tract. And actually, I think now is a pretty good time to take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about specific synergies. Okay, folks. Oops. Okay, folks, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to get going. So I was just talking to a couple of your colleagues during the break, and I know there's a lot of anatomy and neuroanatomy, and I know some of you are trying to look at it in terms of the big picture, like what should we be making sense, or why are we learning all of this? In some ways, you've kind of learned things the opposite way. You've started out like the basic properties of neurons, and you've kind of built yourself up this way. Um, I would say that the best thing that you can probably do for yourself if you're not 100% sure of the material, go over and review it the best that you can. Come back and see me during the week. I'll try to put it into a framework or context that fits you best. Like different types of analogies work better for different individuals, and I'll try my best to make that physiologically relevant for you. But what we're talking about now is, how do you actually move? What are the things that actually cause those central pattern generators, the form of movement that we looked at? How do we actually initiate that type of movement? What are these different muscle groups that get involved? And we started talking about synergies, muscle groups that are involved in specific types of activity. And if we take a look outside of the reticulospinal tract, we have these other groups of neurons that are involved in fine movement. And one of these fine movement groups of neurons is known as the red nucleus. And why do you think it's called the red nucleus? Because it's blue. Nice. Okay. I like the way that you think. Outside the box is really good. I like it. The correct answer is, if you took a look at the brain without doing any staining, just like the raw brain, it would actually look reddish. It's called the red nucleus because of the color red. It is indeed red, reddish, almost pinkish. But this red nucleus, or the rubrospinal cells within the red nucleus, and rubro again meaning red, activate a number of synergies. So this group of neurons in your midbrain will send axons down into your spinal cord and activate motor neurons in your spinal cord that are involved in you bringing your hands. They're involved in your distal limbs. So when you're activating these muscle groups that allow you to like clap your hands, for example, pretending like you're Drake, way to go, nice job, whatever it is, these synergies that get activated in your distal limbs or in your face are starting there, up in the red nucleus. And these are the things that are involved in like gripping, twisting, movement of hands, etc. The reticulospinal and the vestibulospinal ones are much more widespread. They cover larger parts of your body, not for fine movement. I'd like you to make sure that you are clear on fine motor control through the red nucleus versus wide portions of your body for postural support, like the reticulospinal, vestibulospinal tracts as well. So this gets into, how do we actually control things? So that's one group of neurons. Sure, synergies that are involved in like muscle groups that cause the twisting of hands, etc. is one thing, but actually you do a lot more complicated types of movements. Where do all those movements come from? How do those things get started? So if we take a look back at the brain, we have been looking at the central sulcus. Up until now, we've been looking at this area, area S1. We looked at all the somatosensory inputs coming into area S1. A good idea on this weekend to go back and review the pathways that lead into somatosensory area S1. On the opposite side, not on the post-central sulcus, not posterior to it, but anterior or in front of this central sulcus, we have another gyrus known as the motor cortex. And again, in the 1950s, as a pioneer, Walter Penfeld, as a neurosurgeon, operating on individuals who had epilepsy, and he wanted to see what brain regions that he should be operating on in awake patients, he would take an electrode and stimulate and map out different regions of the brain. Again, the brain was relatively a wide unknown or an empty canvas that he wanted to start filling in. And when he started stimulating the precentral gyrus here in the motor cortex, he would be able to elicit movements of hands or movements of legs. And he knew, therefore, that this is the area that actually controlled movement overall. And he called this the motor cortex. This also has somatotopic organization. He knew that if he stimulated this area in the precentral gyrus, that it would cause movement of the arm or of the hand, etc. So this also, in this motor cortex, we actually have this really interesting layer 5 pyramidal cell. These cells are really large cells. These will send projections down from the motor cortex all the way down into the motor nuclei in the brainstem, as well as in the spinal cord. So this is the corticospinal tract that we've been talking about. So now we're circling all the way back. We started with corticospinal tract, and now this is where we begin. The corticospinal tract starts in the motor cortex. This is how you're going to control muscle groups or synergies to begin with. And again, this will be involved in distal limb movements as well as in speech motor nuclei. So it's not all movements that are controlled directly here at the motor cortex, and you'll see and understand the reasons why. If you're thinking about it though, you're actually looking not just at the motor cortex, you're also looking at these associated areas. Just like area S1 just tells you that something is touching your skin, it doesn't tell you if it's moving, etc. It requires these other associated areas. It's exactly the same thing with the premotor cortex. The motor cortex might start the movements, but actually the planning of these movements occurs all the way out here in the prefrontal cortex in these premotor areas that we'll be talking about in a few moments. So again, you don't have to worry about all of the details that are associated with this. This is the primary motor cortex. It has somatotopic organization, which is what you see here. So the legs are in the medial region, the arms are sort of arrayed on the top, and the hands as well, the face region. And you can see that not all of the body is represented well on this somatotopic pathway. And this is the descending corticospinal tract that we talked about earlier. None of the other details on this slide are important. It's really just to relate to you that it's somatotopic. There's an organization of the body on here. So if I stimulated this area on the cortex with an electrode, you would actually see regions of the face contracting, etc. So we've been talking about these synergies, and just like the somatosensory cortex, area S1, do you remember how it was organized? What did we call the organization of the somatosensory cortex? We said these little blocks that represent 2-millimeter columns. What were those columns called? Yeah. So thank you for pointing, hypercolumns. So these hypercolumns, we also have something similar in the motor cortex. In the motor cortex, we might have these motor nuclei that are represented in several of these columns at many, many different loci. So even though the gross exaggeration is that this is where your hand is located on this part of the cortex, it turns out that if you were to take a look at that section of the cortex, that we actually have many different muscle groups being turned on and activated if we were to stimulate this. So this would be the overall finger area, but in fact, if you were to take a look, we might have the second or index finger represented in a muscle synergy. Might be just activated by itself, but you would also find that it's activated in relation to other muscle groups being activated as well. So your wrist muscle might be also activated, your elbow, whether it's flexion of the finger or extension of the finger, all of these are represented in this region of the motor cortex. So this represents a different type of synergy, a group of muscles that are acting together to make use of your index finger. So your index finger, one synergy might be, just like your colleague did, would be to point. So that's like one synergy involved in pointing. Another synergy might be using your index finger and your thumb to be able to hold something. That's another representation in this part of the cortex to give you another type of synergy. So the muscles that are involved in the same activity over and over again, they have the biggest synergies. They develop over time. There's some plasticity of the motor cortex there as well. So going back, if we're looking at these, the motor cortex and we're looking at specific neurons in the motor cortex, one of the things that we will realize really quickly is we need to have this idea of the motor field. So this is that corticospinal axon, one axon. Here's the corticospinal neuron. It's sending its axon down. It's going through the spinal cord. It's a corticospinal axon. It is going to innervate a number of these different muscle groups or motor neurons as it is traveling down. And so all of the different muscle groups that are being innervated, we call these the motor fields that are activated by that one corticospinal axon. So the only other thing I'm going to mention, that layer 5 pyramidal neuron, you actually have a name for it. It's known as the Betz cell. So I showed you on the previous few slides, about 2 or 3 slides back, that we have these really large neurons. And these really large neurons that are involved in these corticospinal tracts are known as these Betz cells. And these are really, really large. If you were to stain the brain, they would like jump out at you. They're so incredibly large compared to other neurons that you find in the brain. Okay, so in terms of somatosensory inputs, usually we talk about reflexes, right? So we talk about reflexes. So you've just touched something, it's painful, you have a reflex to draw your arm away. Does something similar exist in the brain? So if you take a look, you might think, wow, you know, the somatosensory cortex is post-central gyrus, and the motor cortex is precentral gyrus. You know, is there a way for them to directly communicate? It turns out there isn't that type of direct communication across the cortices. It would make a lot of sense if there were, but in fact, there isn't. There's only direct access from some of these cutaneous and proprioceptors. A lot of the cutaneous input, where you're modifying what your motor output is doing, is actually coming from the somatosensory association areas, much farther back in the brain. And most of that information is related to your posture, as well as related to how you're actually moving. So there aren't really direct somatosensory inputs. There really aren't those direct connections like we have within the spinal cord to allow some reflexes, although we do have this really interesting series of reflexes that are known as transcortical reflexes. So these transcortical reflexes don't jump from the precentral to postcentral gyrus. They actually send projections up into the brain, but they actually act very much like a type of reflex that you would normally have. So we have this transcortical stretch reflex. It's very much like the spinal cord mediated reflex, but they tend to be slower. So instead of acting on the order of 30 milliseconds, it might act about 60 milliseconds. However, they're really important in terms of being modifiable. So they can tell us how we should be modifying our particular motions. So here's an example of a transcortical reflex that is working its way up based on the somatosensory information and proprioceptive information from the joints, and going up into the brain and then causing muscle activity to respond in a reflex-like action. So as you're sort of carving up a turkey, the different proprioceptive inputs, where your arms are located in space, where your elbow is bent, etc., allow you to be able to make a smooth cutting motion. And that part of that is because of these inputs, you know exactly how to cut. And again, you're not really thinking about it, you're just going and doing that. If you were to lose that proprioceptive input through a stroke, through a lesion on the spinal cord, whatever it is, the person actually can't synchronize the movements very well. And as a result, these types of cutting motions become very, very exaggerated. They want to have these finer controls, but over time, the arm trajectory becomes very arbitrary. You can't really control the cutting action because you're not getting that input to be able to control the muscle activity. So here's one example of a transcortical reflex that involves proprioceptors. Another one is this grasp reflex. It also sends information from the periphery up into your brain, crosses back down through the motor cortex, that tells you that if, for example, you feel something in your hand, you're holding it, say you have your cell phone sitting in your hand, and you feel it slipping out of your fingers. So for whatever reasons, I think nowadays it's really trendy for individuals to take their cell phone and hold it over like a grate or something, and they hold on to it just with their fingers. If you felt that slipping, you would use this transcortical reflex, detect that slippage, and increase the muscle contraction as a result to make sure that it doesn't slip any further. So the slippage activates the mechanoreceptors. It detects that there's a change in pressure on the mechanoreceptors. The direction of the slip gets computed in the somatosensory association areas. Remember, somatosensory areas, they only tell you what's happening. The association areas tell you the direction of things, the direction of movement. It's all calculated there. And then as a result, they will send information into the motor cortex to increase the activity of muscle synergies that are involved in increasing finger tension. So that's sort of the gross level. We still haven't talked about how you actually control different types of activities. So this gets into these premotor areas. If the motor cortex is really just to turn muscle groups on and off, what you really need to do is to plan like which muscle groups to be turning on and off. This is much the same way as the somatosensory association areas. We have a number of these premotor areas as well. So some of these premotor areas allow us to do really elaborate types of things. They will allow us to select certain muscle groups or muscle synergies in the proper sequence in order to be able to carry out a task that we want to be able to do. Again, there might be some pattern generation that's involved. It's almost like you've used this same motion all the time. You don't even have to think about it. It just comes out automatically. And that's sort of the synergy that's being activated in these pre-motor areas. So you might be one of those individuals, like you're just walking by, you might be like a really friendly individual, and if a stranger just like waves hi to you, you just might activate a motor synergy and just wave hi back, even if you don't know them, right? And these are the types of things that these premotor areas are actually involved with. So they will select the sequence of movements, and sometimes if you keep doing those all the time, it might actually generate almost like a trained or learned behavior in these areas that become automatic. So these premotor areas process a number of sensory inputs, visual, auditory inputs, that will help you cue different types of movements. We won't worry about the dorsal visual stream to the dorsal region of the premotor cortex. We won't worry about this. One example of an area that is part of the premotor cortex, some of you will have heard of Broca's area, and this is the premotor area in your cortex that's involved for sequencing language elements for either speech or writing or typing. So Wernicke's allows you to understand language in order for you to respond back, like to write something back appropriately or to say something. You have to activate muscle groups in your hand for writing or typing, and this is the premotor area that allows you to use language back, and this is the Broca's area, which is a premotor area involving language. So there's also what's known as a visual motor response. And this again involves visual activity. So these premotor cortical areas that are involved in you planning, pre-planning, and activating motor synergies or muscle groups, a lot of it is visual or auditory. And one of these is this visual motor response. So without you even thinking about it, if you see a doorknob, you know how to open it right away, right? And this is sort of the coordinated sets of activities that turn on specific muscle groups for you to reach out, grab the doorknob, and then to turn it. However, once in a while, you actually run into a situation where you have this. Have any of you heard of alien hand syndrome? Maybe in your psychology class, can you tell me, are you showing me your alien hand? What does that mean?
Is this the one where you have a fake hand?
It's not a fake hand.
Or someone else's hand?
So, it's not someone else's hand.
I'm thinking of something else.
So again, your motor activity is determined by what you're seeing and everything else, and I think that's what you're referring to. But that's do more with like empathy and other types of things, and I think that's what you're where you're stabbing someone else's arm and then you're trying to see the response when they think that that's your arm being stabbed. That's totally different. Nice try, though. I like that. It's good. I like the fact that you are aware of all of these great experiments. This is a little bit different. So alien hand syndrome, you don't actually recognize your own hand as your own. So it almost feels like someone else's hand is doing something for you. So there are some really well documented cases where the visual input into the premotor cortex and the planning areas actually don't communicate with each other. So you might, with your left hand, you might actually put a cigarette in your mouth, and there are examples where the right hand actually doesn't know what's happening, and so it takes the cigarette out and crushes it. And the person will keep doing this over and over again because they don't recognize that hand. The visual motor responses aren't there. They don't recognize what's happening. The hand looks like it's someone else's. It's an alien hand syndrome that is well described, and this really messes up this visual motor response. So all of these premotor neurons help to set up the motor cortex. They plan things out. They tell you, if you see that doorknob, you're going to have extensor muscles going out, reaching for it. You're going to have your wrist muscles being activated. You're going to have to do all these things. They plan and sequence the events that are going to happen. However, once that actual event happens, during the turning of the doorknob, the regions of the premotor cortex that were involved in planning all turn themselves off. And again, I want you to remember that point. They're not active during the actual performance of the event itself. They're only there to facilitate things, to get things ready, but once things are actually happening, they turn themselves off. So this gets into some of the specific areas. We talked about Broca's area, that's one. And then we can also talk about two others that I'd like you to know some of the details about: this supplementary motor area, and on the next slide, the cingulate motor area. So this is found on the medial wall. So it's, if you take the two halves, the left and right half of the brain, and you pull them open, on the middle region, on the middle part of the brain, the medial wall of the cortex, you would find this supplementary motor area and the cingulate motor area right underneath it. So this is important. The supplementary motor area is there for volitional signals. When you're voluntarily doing something in relation to the somatosensory signals, then it's the SMA that gets activated. And one of the more important functions that the SMA has is it actually controls the bilateral coordination of limbs. So again, going back to the analogy of playing the piano, where you have to play with the left and right hands, you actually have to plan all of that when you're going to move your left hand, when you're going to move your right hand, through the supplementary motor area. In the cingulate motor area, which is immediately underneath this, this is where some of the emotional aspects and motivational aspects for movement might come into play. This is also known as the limbic motor center, and this is believed to be activated in many epileptic seizures. So when you have different forms of epilepsy, this cingulate motor area also comes into play. Again, we won't go into this in a lot of detail. There are lots of different brain regions that are activated in cortical pattern generation, and these different synergies that have to come into play. The premotor cortex has to become activated. The temporal parietal lobes have to become activated to provide sensory cues to the motor cortex and premotor areas. And then we also have limbic association areas coming in, and the basal ganglia coming in. And what I'm going to do now is to switch gears really quickly. And this is a slide from one of my colleagues from a long, long time ago. Actually, I had the same slide when I was an undergrad many, many years ago as well. If the prefrontal cortex is so important in volitional control and planning and everything else, and it actually doesn't fully form until you're about 21 years of age, this was sort of the argument for why teenagers, for example, shouldn't be engaging in really high-level decision-making, as well as in certain forms of motor skills. So like, should they really be driving at that early age if at 16 you can actually go for your license and this part of your brain isn't fully developed, and this part of your brain also involves the premotor association areas, maybe it's not a good idea for teenagers to be driving. But I think that's an older argument from many, many years ago. And I think nowadays we look at it very, very differently. Okay, so in the last sort of section, I'm going to try to get through as much of this as I can, but I probably won't be able to, and I'll leave the last sort of section on the cerebellum for next week. We're going to be looking at the actual control of volitional drives. So we've looked at these premotor centers. So some of these premotor centers, like the supplemental motor area, the cingulate motor area, etc. We know that the volitional drive from these motor centers have to activate other areas of the brain. And there's a couple of things that I need you to keep in mind. So this is the cerebral cortex, the thing that actually drives the whole process along, including the premotor areas, the association areas, etc. They will then send input into two different structures in the basal ganglia known as the striatum. The striatum itself can be separated out into the caudate and putamen, all part of the basal ganglia. If you go back to the first set of notes that I told you not to worry about, the basal ganglia was defined as these nuclei, including the caudate, putamen, as well as the pallidum and the amygdala. And so if you go back and look at this, the striatum is actually really important because it receives a number of inputs from the cerebral cortex as well as from the thalamus. It tells you like what you should be doing, in other words. And then the pallidum itself also sends information to generate output. And this is really the key. In this hierarchy, this pallidum is the one that is actually the one that we should be the most concerned about. And the reason why that's the case, in this basal ganglia that consists of the caudate, putamen, as well as the pallidum groups of neurons are actually really interesting. The pallidal neurons are tonically discharging. They're always active, in other words. This group of neurons that's involved in movement is always turned on. Okay, so again, think a little bit about this as I go through the next series of slides. This pallidum in the basal ganglia that helps to control movement are tonically discharging. They're always active. And one of the things that they do is that they inhibit. They're there all the time to inhibit the premotor thalamus. We'll forget about the superior colliculus, and we just mentioned that today, so don't worry about the superior colliculus. But it inhibits the premotor thalamus, the mesencephalic locomotory region, etc. Do you remember what the mesencephalic locomotory region was responsible for? What was the MLR helping you to do? Yeah, it was helping you eventually to walk. It would activate the reticulospinal tract, the gigantocellular nucleus. It would then activate the group of central pattern generators in your spinal cord. So it's inhibiting that. It's stopping all of that. It's stopping the premotor thalamus. It's stopping mesencephalic locomotory regions. It's suppressing, in other words, all the time, the motor programs that you are building up. So you have to ask yourself, are you active most of the time? Are you moving most of the time? Or are you not moving most of the time? And yet in your brain, in this small area known as the pallidum, you are actually stopping yourself from moving. Your pallidum is tonically all the time, 24 hours a day, all the time, acting to inhibit your movement. It's stopping premotor programs in the thalamus. It's stopping the mesencephalic locomotory region. It's suppressing motor programs. And in order for you to actually move, you have to actually turn this thing off. It's not the way that you would think movement should occur. If I want to move, I should just activate a group of motor neurons and get them to go. Here, in order for you to get things to move, you actually have to stop the inhibition of the premotor center that this pallidum is involved in doing. So again, keep all of that in mind. So the hierarchy is sort of like this. Eventually, we want movement. We want you to be able to initiate a movement. I want to walk across the stage. I want to take a bow, and I want to walk all the way back. I created a motor movement. In order for me to have these muscle synergies that allowed me to create this movement, I had to activate a series of these premotor neurons that we've just been talking about, the planning and execution of all these things, the firing of the bet cell all the way down to activate motor fields. But the thing is, the pallidum is sitting there stopping this from actually working. I want to be able to turn this on, but the pallidum, and forget the red for the time being, this pallidum is actually tonically inhibiting this group of neurons. I can't turn on this premotor area. But you just saw me do that. How did I turn on those premotor areas? How did I activate those synergies? How did I come up with those motor activities? One of the ways in which we can do this is by activating the striatum. This striatum will actually inhibit the pallidum. So I can inhibit the pallidum by turning on the striatum. And how do I turn on the striatum? I actually have to consciously come up with a motor plan. And this involves the cortex through multiple areas that will activate the striatum and then turn off the pallidum, which will then turn off the inhibition or cause disinhibition of those premotor neurons that will allow me to do the action that I want. It's a very, very common theme that we see in the nervous system about disinhibition, but it makes it really hard for students to understand how this all works, right? Because it's almost backwards. Why would you want to stop movement, and why don't you just activate movement? Here it's an example of disinhibition. So one of those factors that plays a big role in activating the striatum is the amount of dopamine that's available at the level of the striatum. Um, and again, one of those different structures that are involved in modulating the striatum, we want to turn the striatum on so that we can turn the pallidum off. And in order for us to turn the striatum on, we need the cortex, and we need a little bit of help with dopamine. The more dopamine that you have, the easier it is for you to turn on the striatum. So that little arrow in that previous diagram where dopamine was coming in, so you need cerebral cortical activity, but you also need some dopamine. And this dopamine helps to facilitate and activate that striatum. So activate striatum, turn off the pallidum. Is that okay for everyone so far? So we need that dopamine. It helps a little bit in terms of this modulation and activation of the striatum. The one big source of dopamine in this basal ganglia is known as the substantia nigra, and it's called the substantia nigra pars compacta. And again, the striatum helps to choose a particular motor act that you want to perform. It gets input from the cortex and reticular input. And which part of the striatum gets turned on is also determined by the dopaminergic inputs or the circuits from the dopaminergic neurons. So hopefully, if we have this group of tonically active pallidal neurons and we can somehow activate and turn on the striatum, we can turn off the pallidum, leading to the activation of these premotor centers that allow me to then contract my muscles. So a lot of this circuitry was actually known in the 19th century. We knew some of the circuitry back in the 19th century because of different types of diseases. One of the diseases that we know that influences this entire circuit that involves the pallidum is Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease, one of the signs and symptoms is that there is a movement disorder. And it turns out that there are lots of things that are involved in this particular movement disorder. Does anyone know what a fascinating gait is? It's a type of walking. Do you know individuals with Parkinson's, like how they actually begin their movement of walking? It's a very characteristic way. Later, when they have really advanced Parkinson's, they kind of shuffle their feet. But the fascinating gait, do you know how that kind of works? Normally, you don't really walk on your tiptoes, but for Parkinson's patients, they will start their locomotion with a fascinating gait where they're on their tiptoes for the first little while. They also have movement problems because their limbs don't move very well. So they have what's known as cogwheel rigidity. So if I were to pull down on your arm, it would be a nice smooth motion. But if you're going in and you have Parkinson's, it kind of locks in place as someone's moving your arms. They have very characteristic cogwheel rigidity. Their arms don't really move very well. There's very little voluntary movement as the disease progresses. So they, even if they wanted to, it's really hard for them to get up, get out of a chair, and then walk across the room. And when that movement does occur, it tends to be very, very unbalanced. So they can't walk in a straight line very well. They kind of meander a little bit. They shuffle their feet a lot. The movement isn't something that is a balanced type of movement. They also have this other issue. So one issue is they don't move very much. Okay, so they have problems walking. When they walk, there are all sorts of issues. They don't have voluntary movement. But they also have this other issue, which I'm not going to get into. It involves another group of neurons related to Parkinson's, where they have pill rolling. Do you know what pill rolling tremors look like? If you've ever sat there on the TTC, because you see them more and more commonly now with the aging population, these individuals, they're sitting there across from you in the TTC and their hands are kind of doing this. It looks like they're kind of rolling pills. They have Parkinson's, or they have some sort of Parkinsonian-like syndrome. And this over-activation, they can't move very well, and when they do move, it's really jerky type movements. But when they're at rest, actually parts of their body are moving, and this pill rolling tremor is actually really severe. And you can see that this is the substantia nigra in an individual with Parkinson's disease. The substantia nigra neurons, the cell bodies of the neurons, are filled with neuromelanin, which gives us this very characteristic dark appearance. And this is a normal individual. They would have lots and lots of dopamine to turn on the striatal pathway. But here in Parkinson's, those neurons have died off. There is very little dopamine left for them. They can't turn on the striatum, therefore they can't turn off the pallidum, therefore they can't move very well. And as a result, toward the very late stages, they have what's known as a death mask appearance. They can't really have facial expressions because even their facial muscles are locked into place. So again, Parkinson's disease is a disease that's caused by the gradual loss of these substantia nigra containing dopaminergic neurons. Dopamine facilitates the striatal pathway. Turning on the striatum allows you to turn on motor pathways, allows you to turn off the pallidum, and allows you to get to the premotor areas that allow you to turn on muscle activity and synergies. But all of this is lost in Parkinson's. One of the therapies for Parkinson's disease is the use of L-DOPA, and this is a precursor of dopamine. We can't give you dopamine for you to ingest. We can't give you a shot of dopamine. However, you can take in L-DOPA, ingest it as a pill, and then form dopamine in the brain. Dopamine given peripherally actually has lots of bad effects on your heart. It will elevate your blood pressure, increase your heart rate, so it's normally not given peripherally. We only give the precursor to you. If you have Parkinson's, you will have akinesia, which is lack of volitional movement. You can't move by yourself. You can't really activate the striatum. You will have bradykinesia in certain phases. So even if you were able to elicit movement, it would be very, very slow types of movement. And again, this resting tremor that I mentioned to you, characterized by this pill rolling tremor, is where you have excessive depolarization within the pallidum that actually causes oscillatory activity, and that's why you get this back and forth type of movement. And again, unfortunately, I won't have time to get into the mechanisms that are behind this. So hopefully you'll understand how this dopamine from the substantia nigra controls the striatum. We don't have that in Parkinson's. They don't move very well. And that's one of the ways that we know that this circuit that I've just outlined for you is important. We can also modulate the activity of the pallidum through another group of neurons known as the subthalamic neurons. And the excitatory effect on the pallidum can be used to counterbalance the effects on striatal inhibition. So if you have too much striatal, not enough striatal input, you can actually excite the subthalamic nucleus and cause increased activity as well. So the subthalamic nucleus is normally involved in regulating how fast you move, the force of movements, etc. If you overactivate the subthalamic nucleus, you will actually produce things that look a lot like bradykinesia through the circuit that it forms with the pallidum. And again, if you lesion the subthalamic nucleus, you will have vaginismus on that one side, you'll have like really wild arm swinging movements. Um, okay, so how are we doing for time? So I'm just going to take you through two slides related to the cerebellum. We'll wrap things up in about 5 minutes, and then I'll finish off the circuit on the cerebellum in the next lecture. You don't actually need the cerebellum. In fact, there are lots of medical cases that have been documented in the last 5 years where someone is born with the cerebellum, they have a neurodegenerative condition where as a young infant, the cerebellum actually gets degenerated. It's completely lost by the time they're about 5 or 6 years of age. No one actually knew that the cerebellum had disappeared. They had a nice MRI before and a nice MRI 5 years later, and the doctor saw that the cerebellum had completely disappeared. But the young individual actually had no motor difficulties whatsoever. They wouldn't have even known that there were issues with the cerebellum unless they had not gone in because they had a concussion injury. So this is not essential. You don't need the cerebellum at all, and this is sort of the cerebellum that's indicated for you. You don't need the cerebellum at all for any type of motor performance. You can have agenesis of the cerebellum where you might have delayed motor development. So remember I talked to you about at what age you should be standing up, what age you should be walking, what age you should be crawling around. If you don't have the cerebellum, you might have delayed sort of motor development. You might have perpetual clumsiness, but overall the types of movements that you do without a cerebellum aren't very much different than someone who has a perfectly functioning cerebellum. So the cerebellum is sort of one of the conductors of the motor system. It doesn't generate any of the movements by themselves. In fact, the cerebellum is really there to coordinate movements, and as you'll learn at the end of or at the beginning of next week, if you want to stop a movement, like if you're reaching for this laser pointer and you are reaching for it, in order for you to actually make that movement stop at precisely the right time, you need the cerebellum. If you don't have the cerebellum, this is what will happen. You'll reach for it, you won't get it, you'll come back and then reach for it again. You'll be clumsy with your movements. Eventually it'll happen, but the cerebellum is there to precisely end a movement, and we'll see how that works next week. So just a couple of things about the cerebellum. The cerebellar structure actually is a little different than the rest of the brain. So we still have a cortical layer, which is gray on the outside. It receives most of the sensory input and vestibular input that's coming in on different regions, and this is sort of in cross-section. And we'll see some more of this later. And then it also, like the cerebral cortex, has a group of deep nuclei. So this is another group of neurons that are found here, and these are all these axonal tracts kind of going back and forth. And these cerebellar nuclei help to provide excitatory output from the cerebellum to specific motor centers, and again, we'll see that next week. So a couple of things before you guys go away, and I'll finish off the rest of the lecture next week. You know, there's a lot of material in this course, and I know some of you are really, really concerned about the term test, and there were a lot of different concepts and a lot of different things for you to go over and study. I'd like you to at least take a look at your notes. Spend about 15-20 minutes just organizing your notes, going back over things that you know are going to be really challenging for you to memorize later, at the very least. So what I'm going to do for you over the weekend is to give you sort of an outline of things that I think are the most important things for you to study over the weekend. Please spend time doing it. Don't leave it till like next weekend. It's going to be too late. There's already going to be another 100 pages of notes for you waiting. So don't do that. Spend time this weekend studying, and hopefully you'll get some good leeway into that. Have a great weekend. I'll see you all next week.